What if the stories your father told you as a child were not myths? What if the history preserved by your grandparents carried truths that were never written in textbooks? And what if the answers to the questions about identity, migration, faith, and belonging had been hidden in plain sight all along? After my father's death, I felt an overwhelming responsibility to preserve the story he entrusted to me. A story that had been passed from generation to generation. A story about our people's journey from Israel through Abyssinia and eventually to the sacred slopes of Mount Kenya. But there was one question I could not escape. Would anyone believe it? Or would it simply be dismissed as another African legend, another folklore? Welcome to episode 10 of my memoir series, Echo of My Father's Voice. Today I invite you to join me on a spiritual and historic quest, a journey that challenged everything I thought I knew about identity, history, and the possibility that some African oral traditions may preserve memories of far older than we have been taught. My father's stories refused to leave me. After my father passed away, his voice continued to echo in my heart. Again and again, I remembered the day I asked him, "Where do we come from?" I can still hear his voice as I asked, "Papa, where do we come from? Where do we originally come from?" And he replied, "Kiuma gitu ni Israel and Abyssinia. Hedeo mari adwarurera rumwe." Our people came from Israel and Abyssinia. During those days, they were people of the same lineage. At the time, I listened respectfully, but years later, living thousands of miles away in America, those words began to take on a completely different meaning. I found myself asking, could there be evidence? Could there be traces of this story hidden in history, archaeology, language, religion, or even genetics? I knew I owed it to my father to investigate. Unlike my ancestors, I had something they never possessed. I had the internet. I had digital archives, academic databases, online libraries, social media. I could search across continents without leaving my room. What began as curiosity quickly became an obsession, I immersed myself in African history, biblical stories, anthropology, archaeology, genealogy, and oral traditions. The deeper I searched, the more surprised I became. I discovered others who were asking the same questions. Historians who had noticed unusual cultural parallels. Researchers who believed that some African community preserved traditions with possible connection to the ancient Israel. Instead of finding dead ends, I kept finding breadcrumbs, and each breadcrumb pointed me towards my father's story. One of the first books that captured my attention was A Kikuyu Mystery Revealed, Descendants of Asher, A Lost Tribe of Israel by Mukuhe wa Mwangi. The author explored archival records, colonial observations, and historical documents. What shocked me was learning that early British colonial administrators themselves had noted similarities between Kikuyu religious practices and Judaism. These observations were not coming from modern social media discussions. They appeared in historical records, in British archives. Even more fascinating were reports of artifacts preserved in British museums, including pottery, containing symbols resembling the Star of David. Suddenly, my father's story became real. Other people had also noticed connections long before me. As I continued reading, I encountered additional books on the same topic. Prehistorical people, the Central Kikuyu before 1970, Abantu from the Nile to Kirimara, Bantu Hebrew Israelites, Identity Revealed. These books explored migration theories, suggesting movements of the Bantu people from northern and northeastern Africa into the Mount Kenya region and to the rest of Africa. While scholars disagreed on many details, one thing became clear. History was far more complicated than the simplified versions we learned in colonial schools. The idea that African people had rich migration stories was not controversial. The debate was about where these journeys began, and that question captivated me. The Bantu Calendar Revelation, a book I encountered, titled Sunset to Sunset, Our Bantu Calendar, reading it felt like a lightning strike. The author argued that many Bantu traditions preserved elements found in biblical Israel culture. The more I read, the more connections I began noticing. Not proof, not certainty, but patterns. Patterns that deserved investigation. I realized I was no longer simply researching history. I was reclaiming memory. Sometimes clues appeared in the most unexpected places. One day I was visiting an Ethiopian family friend. I asked my daughters in Kikuyu, my mother tongue, if they wanted mai. In Kikuyu, mai means water. Before I could translate, our Ethiopian host immediately understood and brought water. I was surprised. She explained that in Tigrinya, in northern Ethiopia, mai also means water. A simple coincidence, perhaps, but moments like this made me wonder how many linguistic footprints remained from ancient interactions between neighboring peoples. As I studied scripture, certain passages seemed to take on new significance. Zephaniah 3:10 says, "From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my worshippers, my dispersed people, will bring me offerings." Those words gripped me. Why specifically mention Ethiopia? What historical memories were preserved within that passage, that verse? Then there was Deuteronomy chapter 8:28, a chapter describing exile, displacement, oppression, and survival of the children of Israel. As an African woman familiar with colonial history, I could not ignore the emotional resonance of those verses. The Bible was no longer simply a spiritual book. It began to feel like a historical conversation, a conversation that included Africa. Interestingly, some of the thought-provoking moments happened while caring for patients at the clinic where I practiced. Many would ask me where I was from. Often they guessed I was from Ethiopia. One patient who is a missionary told me that he had visited Ethiopia and heard traditions connecting the regions to biblical history. Another patient surprised me by mentioning an old theory that the Star of Bethlehem may have been observed from East Africa. These conversations sent me down entirely new paths of research. The more questions people asked, the more questions I asked myself. That evening, I remembered stories my grandmother used to tell. As children, she spoke of extraordinary Christmas stars appearing over Mount Kenya. At this time, we simply enjoyed the stories. But now I wondered, could oral tradition preserve memories of astronomical events? Could there be deeper historical significance? As I researched, I discovered the work of astronomer Carlis Koofmans, who had lectured extensively about the Star of Bethlehem. Suddenly, another thread emerged, not proof, but another clue, another mystery, another invitation to keep searching. Determined to hear different perspectives, I reached out to Dr. Kue from the Ethiopian Jewish community in Texas. Our conversation was remarkable. He described traditions preserved by his people that sounded strikingly familiar. Burnt offerings beneath sacred trees, beneath fig trees, seasonal calendars, monotheistic worship, oral histories of migration and exile, shared reverence for ancestry, shared commitment to preserving memory. Listening to him felt like hearing echoes of stories I had grown up with Kenya. or growing up in Kenya. It reinforced my belief that African oral traditions deserve serious attention rather than automatic dismissal. My search eventually led me to contact rabbis across Minnesota. Most declined, some never responded. But finally, a rabbi from St. Paul agreed to speak with me. During our conversation, I shared my father's story. I described Kikuyu traditions, the sacred fig trees, circumcisions, offerings, prayers to one supreme God, communal laws emphasizing justice and responsibility. The rabbi listened carefully. Rather than dismissing the similarities, he acknowledged that they were fascinating. At one point, he told me, "You should write a book." That simple statement stayed with me, because by then I realized that this journey was bigger than me. It was about preserving memory. It was about asking questions. It was about ensuring future generations could decide for themselves. Some people ask, why does any of this matter? Because identity matters. History matters. Memory matters. For generations, many African stories were dismissed, distorted, or erased. Colonial narratives often told us who we were. This journey taught me that we must also listen to our elders, our grandparents, our oral historians, our communities, not because every truth is automatically true, or every story is automatically true, but because every story deserves to be heard. My father's voice started this journey, a simple answer to a simple question. Our people come from Israel and Abyssinia. Whether one views that statement as history, tradition, theology, or hypothesis, it changed my life. It inspired a search that led across continents, across libraries, across scriptures, across generations. And perhaps the greatest lesson I learned is this: history is not only found in books. Sometimes it lives in the memories of our elders. Sometimes it survives in language. Sometimes it hides in rituals. Sometimes it waits quietly in oral traditions until someone is willing to listen. And perhaps the greatest act of reclaiming identity is not proving every answer. It's having the courage to ask the questions. Thank you for joining me. If this story resonates with you, please subscribe to my channel, share, and join me as we continue exploring identity.